There's usually some degree of prep work that takes place on every surface that I paint on, regardless of what that surface is, including paper. I will occasionally use paper for some of my airbrush projects, although I don't use paper very often for a couple reasons. One being paper is very absorbent, so as soon as I begin spraying paint onto this sheet of paper, the paper will begin to absorb all the moisture in the paint, and it will either try to curl or it will warp on me. The easiest way to prevent that is to use a high quality heavyweight paper. This is Kansan Smooth Bristol 100-pound paper. 100 pounds is the minimum that I recommend for airbrush purposes. Either 100 pounds or 260 GSM, depending on where you're at in the world. The paper will still try to warp on you somewhat, but the heavier weight paper diminishes that effect. The other reason that I don't typically like to work on paper is right now I have a very smooth surface, but it seems like every time I begin to spray paint onto a paper surface, little fibers start poking out of the paper. I don't know exactly what causes it. I assume it's because of the paper absorbing the moisture from the paint. But you get these little fibers sticking up, and that gives you kind of a rough textured surface to begin with. But worse is those little fibers catch overspray and they can wreak havoc on your work. So my goal for this video is to show you guys the process that I use to prep a good heavyweight sheet of paper before I begin to airbrush it. The process begins with paint. I'm using Auto Air White, but you can use whatever color you want to wind up airbrushing your actual project over. And what I'll do is I'll put 6, 7, maybe 8 coats of paint on this sheet of paper, drying with the air in between, and then I'll show you the next step. I didn't count how many coats I actually put on this piece of paper. It was probably 7, 8, or 9, somewhere in that range. And I know it's probably hard to tell on video because you're looking at just a plain white piece of paper. But if you look at the shadow underneath it being cast, there's a little bit of a hump there and a little bit of a hump on this side. So once I started putting paint on this sheet of paper, it began trying to warp. It's got a warp running up and down there and a warp running up and down there. By using 7, 8, 9 coats of paint on this piece of paper initially, what we've done is effectively pre-warp the sheet of paper before we ever actually begin to airbrush our artwork onto it. And by using the 7, 8, 9 coats of paint, we've effectively closed off all the pores in the sheet of paper so that when we begin airbrushing our actual artwork onto this sheet, it shouldn't absorb any more moisture. From this point, I would deal with the little fibers, and on this particular paper I really don't feel any of those little fibers sticking up. Some papers are worse about that than others. I've never actually used this Kansan. I normally use a Strathmore 500 series Bristol, which is pretty notorious for getting those little fibers. But if this piece of paper did have those little fibers on it, the next step in the process is to take a Scotch-Brite pad. I'm using a gray pad. It doesn't matter whether you use a gray, red, or even a green Scotch-Brite pad. And I would just run over the entire surface of the paper with the Scotch-Brite pad and knock all those little fibers off. That's good, but like I said, that particular paper didn't have any real fiber sticking out of it. And then I just take a tack rag and wipe off the excess. Sometimes, like I said, some papers are worse than others. If you got really bad fibers coming out, once I do the Scotch-Brite, I will come back in and spray another 7 or 8 or 9 coats of the white and let that dry. So I'll go ahead and do that now, just because that's the process I normally use, and then we'll go from there. So I put another 7 to 8 to 9 coats of paint on this piece of paper. The next step in the process is to use your Scotch-Brite pad again. If you've got the issue with the little paper fibers sticking up, which normally you can feel those fibers if they're there. Like I said earlier, this piece of paper is relatively smooth. I really don't feel any fibers, but if I did, it's the same process. You just kind of go over the sheet and knock those fibers off or lay them down with your Scotch-Brite pad. The next step in the process is I'll take a 1000 grit piece of sandpaper and actually sand the paint to a very smooth surface. It doesn't take very much, it's relatively quick. However, because I use this backing board on my easel, I normally have my projects taped up here. I can't run the sandpaper over this right now because you can feel where the tape is lumped up on the back side of the paper. I want it to be very flat, so I'll remove the tape. And then I can just lay a sheet of paper up here with my 1000 grit sandpaper, and I'm just going to sand it. Once you have it sanded, you can take a tack rag and knock off any residual sanding dust. And at this point, we have a very smooth, prepped paper surface that's ready to airbrush on. From here, I will set this down on a flat countertop or a table and allow it to cure fully for about 48 hours before I actually airbrush on it. Allowing this to sit on a flat panel will actually help to flatten out the sheet of paper again before you begin to paint on it as well. This is a sheet of Strathmore Series 500 Bristol that I had already cut to size and prepped using the exact same method that I just showed you guys how to do. I just, for whatever reason, didn't film the process when I prepped this sheet. But this sheet is the surface that I'm going to be painting my next airbrush project on, which I will share with you guys from start to finish. So some of you might be wondering, hey, is this really necessary if I'm just working on paper? And the reality is it's not. You can paint directly onto any sheet of paper if you choose to do so. But having those initial base coat layers, for one, allows you to easily remove any paper fibers that might be sticking up out of the page once it absorbs moisture. And two, it allows the paper to warp before you actually start doing your airbrush artwork. By allowing the page to sit on a level surface and cure for 48 hours, somewhere in that range, it will flatten itself back out for the most part. And that will give you less headaches when you actually begin airbrushing your artwork on. I think you'll also see that having that prepped surface responds really well to scratching and erasing techniques and even masking techniques. Once you have a base coat of paint on the paper, regular paper, if you stick masking tape or transfer tape or something else, you run the risk of actually tearing the paper when you're removing that mask. When you have that base coat on here, it's not quite as much of a risk. It can still happen, but it's less likely to happen. So this is just a budget-friendly way to get a really good surface to paint on. There's tons of different papers out there. I've tried some of the synthetic papers and they have their pros and cons. One of the cons is they're relatively expensive. This is still pretty cheap and it will give you fantastic results. So I hope you guys got something out of this. Remember to like, subscribe, and share if you did, and I'll see you guys next time.